You think you understand time because you feel it moving through you, because you watch clocks tick and calendars change and your body slowly grow older. But that confidence is an illusion created by your brain, not a truth about reality, because time as you imagine it does not exist as a flowing thing, not as a river carrying you from past to future, not as a force pushing events forward, but as a concept. Your mind invented to survive in a universe far stranger than intuition allows. And the moment you question that familiar picture, everything begins to unravel. Because if time truly flowed like a river, then the most basic question would expose the lie immediately. How fast does it flow? 1 second per second. A statement so meaningless it explains nothing at all, like saying a table is 1 table long. And yet this empty idea is the foundation of how most people think about existence, believing that moments move while they remain still, when in truth nothing about time behaves that way, because time does not move, does not act, does not cause, and does not push you anywhere. And the confusion starts inside your own head where you trust, your internal clock, even though it is wildly unreliable, a fragile biological trick that says more about your brain than the universe. Because when you count seconds in your mind, you are not measuring time itself, but running a private mental program shaped by habit and perception. And a simple experiment reveals this clearly when you try to count to 60 without a clock, and discover that some people hear an internal voice while others see images, numbers sliding past like a tape measure. And these two methods produce completely different abilities, because the visual counters can multitask while the verbal counters cannot, proving that what you feel as the passage of time is not universal, not objective, and not shared, but a personal construction, a hallucination generated by neural circuits, which means that when physics talks about time, it must discard human intuition entirely and focus only on what can be measured. And when it does that, the answer is shockingly simple. Time is just a way of ordering events, nothing more. A labeling system rather than a substance, like laying out cards on a table and saying one comes before another without imagining the table itself flowing, because time is not a container that exists even when nothing happens, as Newton once believed, but a measure of change itself, inseparable from physical processes. So if absolutely nothing in the universe changed, then time would lose all meaning, because a second cannot exist without something to define it, such as an oscillating atom or a swinging pendulum. And this is where language traps us into error, making us say things like time ages us or time spoils milk, when in reality chemical reactions and entropy do the work while time merely tracks the rate, just as inches do not build a house but only describe its dimensions. And once you understand that time is a ruler rather than a worker, the universe becomes even more unsettling, because rulers can bend, and in reality time does bend, stretching and slowing depending on motion and gravity, a fact proven beyond doubt, meaning that a second is not the same everywhere, that clocks moving fast or sitting in strong gravity tick differently, not because they malfunction, but because reality itself is structured this way, where you are always moving through the universe at a constant speed shared between space and time. So when you move through space, you must mathematically move slower through time, and if you could ever move at the speed of light, all motion would be spent on space, leaving none for time, freezing it completely from your perspective. And although you do not feel this effect in daily life because you move so slowly compared to cosmic scales, it is real enough that satellites must account for it, or modern technology would fail, and this alone destroys the idea of a universal now, because if clocks disagree, then simultaneity collapses, meaning there is no single present moment shared by the entire universe, no cosmic heartbeat ticking in unison, no master clock behind reality, and instead the universe exists as a vast structure of events ordered but not flowing, static yet experienced dynamically by consciousness. And this realization sets the stage for the deepest confusion of all, because if time does not flow and the laws of physics mostly work the same forward and backward, then why does the past feel fixed and the future open? Why can you remember breakfast but not tomorrow? Why does an egg shatter but never reassemble? And the answer is not time itself but entropy, the natural drift from order to disorder, the statistical fact that there are vastly more messy states than organized ones, giving rise to the arrow you mistake for time's direction, meaning your sense of time passing is really your brain registering increasing disorder, and this prepares you for an even more disturbing conclusion, one that replaces the river of time with a frozen structure where past, present, and future all exist together. But to see that clearly, you must first understand how entropy creates memory, direction, and meaning, and that is where the story truly begins. If time does not flow, and if the laws of physics show no preference for past or future, then the question becomes unavoidable. Why does life feel one-directional? Why does memory point backward and anticipation forward? And why does the universe seem to move from what was to what will be? Because this sensation is so powerful that it convinces us something fundamental must be driving it, yet the driver is not time itself but probability, because the universe does not care about stories or narratives or meaning. It cares about arrangements, and some arrangements are simply more likely than others, which is why an egg can fall and shatter in countless ways, but can only exist whole in one precise configuration, and once it breaks, the universe has an overwhelming number of paths available to it that keep the pieces scattered, making the reverse process so improbable that it might as well be impossible. And this statistical imbalance is what we call entropy, not a force but a tendency, a counting problem that favors disorder over order. And it is this tendency that gives rise to the arrow you mistake for time. Because when you look at the world, you are not sensing time moving forward, but watching order decay into mess. And your brain, evolved to detect change and survival-relevant patterns, labels this increase in disorder as the passage of time, which is why memory only works in one direction. Because memories themselves are physical records, low entropy imprints stored in neurons, and you cannot store a record of the future because it has not yet been disordered enough to leave a trace, meaning the past feels solid and the future feels open not because time flows, but because entropy increases. And if the universe were ever to reach maximum entropy, a state of perfect uniformity where nothing interesting happened, your brain would be unable to distinguish past from future at all, because there would be no patterns to track, no differences to compare, no records to form. And in such a universe, the arrow of time would vanish completely, not because time stopped, but because nothing would change in a meaningful way, which reveals that what you experience as time's direction is deeply tied to your role as a pattern-recognizing machine, a disorder detector embedded in a universe that began in an unusually ordered state. And this brings us to the uncomfortable realization that your sense of now is also a construction. Because even though it feels absolute and shared, physics shows that simultaneity depends on motion. So two events that appear to happen at the same time to you will not be simultaneous to someone moving relative to you. And both perspectives are equally correct, which means there is no universal present moment slicing cleanly across the cosmos, but rather countless different nows depending on how you move, like slicing a loaf of bread at different angles and insisting one slice is the real one, when in fact the loaf exists as a whole, and this is where the idea of the universe as a four-dimensional structure emerges, a block of events where past, present, and future all coexist as coordinates rather than moments that come into being and vanish. And your consciousness moves through this structure not as a passenger being carried by time, but as a process unfolding within it, like a spotlight illuminating one frame at a time in a film reel where all frames already exist. And this idea feels deeply unsettling because it challenges free will and identity, yet it does not remove choice so much as redefine it. because even if the structure exists as a whole, the patterns within it still obey rules, still require intermediate steps, still demand causes for effects, meaning you cannot skip ahead to outcomes without becoming the process that produces them, and understanding this requires abandoning the comforting metaphor of time as a flowing river and replacing it with geometry, with relationships between events that do not care. About human intuition, and just as some people can count time visually while others rely on an inner voice, physics demands new mental tools that feel unnatural at first, because learning about time is not just acquiring information, but rewriting the internal imagery you use to understand reality. And this rewriting is painful, because it forces you to let go of the idea that the universe is unfolding for you, revealing instead that you are embedded within it, part of the same statistical machinery that drives entropy forward. And this realization prepares you for an even deeper question, because if time is nothing more than an ordering of events within the universe, then what happens when you trace that order all the way back to its beginning, to the moment when the universe itself came into existence, and whether the question of what came before is even meaningful at all? When you follow this trail all the way back, past memories and records and entropy gradients, you eventually collide with a question that refuses to behave like the others. Because if time is only a way of ordering change inside the universe, then asking what happened before the universe began may be a mistake of language rather than a mystery of physics, since all our clocks, all our atoms, all our processes exist within the universe and depend on it. So if the universe itself emerged in an event we call the Big Bang, a state where space and energy and structure first appeared, then time as a measure of change may have emerged with it, not before it, meaning that the idea of a before might be as meaningless as asking what lies north of the North Pole, a question that sounds valid but collapses when examined, because north is defined by the surface it measures, just as time is defined by the processes it orders. And yet your mind resists this conclusion fiercely, because it is built to demand stories, beginnings, sequences that stretch backward without end. And this creates a deep tension between psychology and cosmology, where your internal counter insists there must have been something earlier while physics offers no place to put it. And this tension reveals how poorly equipped intuition is for understanding reality at its extremes. Because intuition evolved to track tigers and seasons, not singularities in space-time geometry, and when you try to force the universe into narrative form, you encounter paradoxes that feel profound but may simply be category errors, arising from applying human storytelling instincts to a system that does not operate in stories but in states and transitions. And this becomes even clearer when you consider how unstable your sense of duration really is. Because if counting a single minute can vary dramatically depending on whether your brain uses sound or imagery, then your sense of eternity or origin is likely even less reliable. Meaning the confidence with which humans ask about the beginning of time may be misplaced. And instead of imagining a ticking clock that suddenly switched on, it may be more accurate to imagine a boundary beyond which the concept of ticking has no meaning at all. And this does not imply that physics has reached a dead end, but rather that our mental models are insufficient. Because throughout history, progress has come not from adding new facts to old frameworks, but from replacing the frameworks themselves, as when classical mechanics gave way to relativity, forcing us to abandon absolute time and space in favor of a unified structure where motion and measurement are inseparable. And this pattern continues, because even relativity, successful as it is, breaks down when pushed to the earliest moments of the universe, where quantum effects dominate and space-time itself may become uncertain, fluctuating, or emergent rather than fundamental, suggesting that time might not be a basic ingredient of reality at all, but something that arises from deeper processes, much like temperature emerges from the motion of molecules, rather than existing independently. And this idea further undermines the instinct to treat time as a universal backdrop, because if time can emerge, then it can also dissolve under certain conditions, such as near black holes where gravitational effects slow clocks to a standstill for distant observers, demonstrating again that time is not a rigid framework, but a flexible feature shaped by matter and energy. And yet, despite all this abstraction, your daily life continues to function because the strange behavior of time is hidden beneath scales and speeds far removed from human experience, allowing intuition to work well enough locally even while failing globally. And recognizing this split between local usefulness and cosmic inaccuracy is crucial, because it shows that common sense is not a guide to truth, but a tool for survival, a set of shortcuts optimized for efficiency rather than correctness. And once you accept that your mental images of time are provisional rather than sacred, you become open to the possibility that reality does not owe you an intuitive explanation, that it may be structured in ways that feel alien and even absurd. And this humility is necessary to approach the final and most unsettling implication of modern physics. Because if time is not fundamental, if past and future coexist as parts of a larger structure, and if beginnings themselves may be boundaries rather than moments, then the question is no longer where time came from, but what it means to exist within a universe where the flow you feel so strongly may be nothing more than a shadow cast by deeper laws you are only beginning to glimpse. Once you accept that time may not be fundamental, and that the flow you feel could be an emergent effect rather than a built-in feature of reality, the next illusion to fall is the idea of a universal present, because the feeling that there is a single moment called now shared by everyone everywhere is one of the strongest intuitions the human mind possesses. Yet physics shows it to be a convenience rather than a truth, since simultaneity depends entirely on motion, meaning that two events you judge to happen at the same time will not be simultaneous for someone moving relative to you. And this disagreement is not due to faulty instruments or perception, but arises from the structure of space-time itself, where different observers slice the four-dimensional universe at different angles, and each slice is equally valid, destroying the notion of a master clock ticking behind the scenes. And this forces you to confront a radical picture in which the universe is not unfolding moment by moment, but exists as a complete structure, a block of events laid out in space-time, where what you call the past and future are simply regions located at different coordinates, much like distant cities exist simultaneously with your own location, even though you cannot experience them directly. And in this view, your consciousness does not ride a river of time, but moves along a path within the block, illuminating one event after another, without bringing them into existence or erasing them when they pass. And this analogy, unsettling as it is, explains why relativity works so precisely, because it treats time not as a flowing substance, but as a dimension intertwined with space, subject to geometry rather than narrative. And while this raises immediate worries about free will, those worries often stem from misunderstanding what the block picture implies, because predictability does not automatically follow from existence, as even in a fully laid out structure, the complexity of interactions and the role of entropy ensure that outcomes cannot be arbitrarily skipped or reversed, meaning that choice and causation remain meaningful within the constraints of physical law. And recognizing this helps dissolve the fear that a static universe would render life meaningless, because meaning does not come from temporal flow, but from relationships between events and the processes that connect them. And this perspective also clarifies why physics often feels so counterintuitive, since it demands that you abandon the internal imagery that once served you well, such as rivers and ticking clocks, and replace them with geometric and statistical concepts that do not map neatly onto everyday experience. Much like learning to visualize higher dimensions requires mental tools that feel unnatural at first. And this cognitive shift mirrors the earlier example of different people counting time in their heads, because just as some rely on an inner voice while others use visual patterns, understanding time at a fundamental level requires choosing representations that may clash with your habitual way of thinking. And the difficulty you feel is not a sign of failure, but evidence that you are pushing beyond the limits of intuition. Because intuition evolved for navigating a narrow slice of reality, not for comprehending a universe where clocks disagree and simultaneity dissolves, and yet even as you adopt this abstract view, you must remember that all descriptions, including mathematical ones, are translations rather than direct captures of reality, meaning that different scientists can hold the same equations in mind while visualizing them in radically different ways, each internal model incomplete yet useful. And this diversity of representation underscores how fragile common sense truly is, because when two people agree verbally about time, they may be agreeing only at the level of output, while their internal machinery remains incompatible, a fact that matters deeply when teaching and learning complex ideas, as misunderstanding often arises not from lack of intelligence, but from mismatched mental imagery. And acknowledging this prepares you for the final challenge, because once you see time as a dimension and the universe as a block, you must confront what it means to be a conscious system embedded within that structure, experiencing change without creating it, and this question leads directly into the nature of observation, identity, and the role consciousness plays in giving the universe a sense of flow that physics itself does not provide. When you reach this point, the question is no longer about clocks or equations, but about you. Because if the universe exists as a complete structure where past and future are simply different locations, then why does experience feel so vivid, so immediate, so alive? And the answer lies not in time itself, but in consciousness, because consciousness is not a thing moving through time, but a process that orders information, compares states, and creates continuity, meaning that what you call the present is not a physical slice of the universe, but a psychological construction assembled moment by your brain, stitching together sensory input, memory, and expectation into a coherent story. And this story is what gives life its apparent flow, even though the underlying structure does not flow at all, because your brain is a machine built to model change, to detect differences between states and use them to guide behavior. And in doing so, it creates the illusion of motion through time, much like a movie appears to move even though it is nothing more than a sequence of still frames illuminated in order. And this explains why attention can distort your sense of duration, making moments stretch under fear or collapse under joy, because attention alters how densely information is processed and stored, changing the subjective spacing between memories, which you then interpret as time speeding up or slowing down, even though nothing about physical time has changed. And this also explains why memory is asymmetric, because you remember the past not because it is gone, but because records exist there, physical imprints formed as entropy increased, while the future lacks such records because it has not yet undergone the processes that would create them, meaning your sense of direction is anchored in information flow rather than temporal flow. And this realization reframes identity itself, because you are not a static object persisting through time, but a continuously updated pattern, a self-maintaining process that exists only by changing, like a flame that remains recognizable even though none of its molecules stay the same. And in this sense, you are not moving through time any more than a whirlpool moves through a river, because the whirlpool is the motion, a stable pattern formed by constant change. And this metaphor reveals why fears about determinism often miss the mark, because even if the universe is structured, the patterns within it, including you, are defined by their internal dynamics, not by an external flow imposing outcomes, meaning that your choices are real not because the future is empty, but because choice is part of the causal fabric that connects events. And understanding this dissolves the false opposition between physics and meaning, showing that meaning arises from relationships, from how patterns influence other patterns, not from an imagined freedom to float outside the laws of nature. And once you see yourself this way, the universe no longer feels like a cold, static block, but a vast network of interacting processes, each with its own internal perspective, and consciousness becomes the lens through which a timeless structure is experienced as a story, which brings you to a final unsettling thought, because if experience depends on information processing and entropy gradients, then the sense of time you cherish is fragile, contingent, and temporary, tied to the specific conditions that allow complexity and memory to exist at all, conditions that will not last forever. When you follow this logic to its end, you arrive at a conclusion that is both humbling and unsettling, because if the sensation of time depends on entropy, memory, and information processing, then time as you experience it is not guaranteed to exist forever, since the universe is slowly moving toward a state of maximum entropy where differences fade, gradients flatten, and nothing interesting happens anymore, a state often called heat death. And in such a universe there would be no clocks in any meaningful sense, no memories being formed, no records distinguishing one moment from another, because without change there is nothing to order, and without order there is no time to experience, meaning that the flow you feel so deeply is a temporary feature of a young, structured universe rather than a fundamental aspect of reality. And this realization forces you to see your own existence in a new light, because your life unfolds in a rare window where complexity is possible, where entropy increases in just the right way to allow stars, chemistry, biology, and thought to emerge, making your experience of time a fragile gift rather than a cosmic constant. And yet this does not make it meaningless, because meaning does not come from permanence but from structure, from the relationships between events that briefly resist disorder long enough to matter. And this is why moments feel precious, even when physics tells you they are just coordinates in space-time. Because value is something conscious systems assign, not something the universe hands out. And once you accept this, you can stop demanding that reality conform to human intuition, recognizing instead that intuition is a tool shaped by evolution, useful locally and misleading globally, and that confusion is not a failure of understanding but a sign that you are approaching the limits of familiar concepts, because every major advance in science has required abandoning comfortable metaphors in favor of stranger, more accurate ones, from the motion of the earth to the relativity of time itself. And this pattern will continue as we probe deeper, possibly revealing that even space-time is not fundamental but emergent from deeper quantum structures we do not yet fully grasp, meaning that future theories may dissolve time even further, replacing it with relations, correlations, or information flow. And while this may sound abstract, it carries a quiet reassurance, because it shows that humans are not passive passengers swept along by an invisible river, but active participants in the unfolding patterns of the universe. Embedded within the same laws we seek to understand, capable of reflecting on them, despite being made of the very processes they describe. And this is perhaps the most extraordinary fact of all, that a universe with no obligation to be comprehensible has produced minds that can question its deepest assumptions, even to the point of realizing that one of the most familiar features of experience, the feeling of time passing, is not what it seems. And if this realization leaves you unsettled, that is not a problem to be solved, but a doorway to be crossed, because discomfort marks the boundary between intuition and truth, and beyond that boundary lies a clearer, if stranger, picture of reality where time is not a river carrying you forward, but a structure you inhabit, a ruler you use, and a mirror reflecting the limits and the power of the mind trying to understand it.